Sometimes life feels like an out-of-control roller coaster. There are days when everything seems to be going well, and suddenly, without warning, something changes. Worries begin to invade, stress builds up, and questions start to arise. Why is this happening to me? What have I done to deserve this? How long will this situation last? We have all been through moments like this, but here comes the interesting part, which we may not always remember. God knows exactly what you are going through, and not only knows, but deeply understands. He knows every detail of your life, from the most visible battles to those you carry silently, the ones that nobody else notices, but that wear you down day by day. Have you ever wondered why you feel like you are carrying so much weight on your shoulders? Maybe it's because you are trying to do everything alone, believing that you must be strong, that you should not show weakness. But what if I told you that you are not alone in this struggle? This episode is an invitation, a call for you to stop for a moment, breathe, and remember that you don't need to carry that weight by yourself. God is by your side, waiting for you to trust in Him, to completely surrender to His hands. I know it sounds easy to say, but it's not always so simple to do. Sometimes it seems that letting go of control makes us vulnerable. But what if I told you that it's in that vulnerability that you truly find peace? The purpose of this episode is for us to explore together what it means to surrender to God in difficult times, to understand why, despite not seeing the end of the tunnel, He has a perfect plan for you. It's a reminder that God is not only present in the good times, but especially in the dark days. He knows what you're going through and wants you to trust that in the end, everything has a greater purpose, a purpose that you may not understand now, but that will reveal itself in time. Let's start with the basics. What does it really mean to surrender to God? Sometimes we hear these words and they sound very spiritual, but when we're in the middle of a storm, it's not always easy to apply. It's like we know we should trust, but there's a part of us that keeps clinging to control, that part that doesn't want to let go because it's afraid of what might happen if it just lets go. The first thing you have to understand is that surrendering to God does not mean giving up in the sense of giving up. It's not about abandoning your efforts or your responsibilities, but about knowing that there are things beyond your control. It's accepting that even though you do your best, there are situations that only God can handle, and that's okay. Imagine for a moment that you're in the middle of a river with a strong current. You're struggling to swim against the flow, trying your hardest, but the more you struggle, the more tired you become, and the more the water drags you. Now think, what would happen if, instead of fighting, you allowed yourself to flow with the current? That's what God is asking you, to trust in Him, to let yourself be carried by His plan, because He knows where He is guiding you, even if you can't see it now. Surrendering to God is recognizing that He is in control and that His plan is greater than anything we can imagine. But of course, that doesn't mean it will be easy. We are human, and one of our biggest struggles is letting go of the reins, especially when we feel that everything is out of control. But it's precisely in those moments when we need to trust that God knows what He's doing. Sometimes the pain, confusion, or fear make us forget that we are not alone. When things get tough, our first reaction is usually to try to solve everything on our own. We tell ourselves, I have to find a solution, I can't fail, or if I don't do something, everything will collapse. But what if I told you that the pressure you feel is not what God wants for you? He doesn't want you to live with that constant burden. Jesus made it clear in Matthew 11:28, "Come to me, all you who are weary and burdened, and I will give you rest." This is not just a nice verse to read in times of tranquility. It's a direct invitation to you right now in the midst of your storm. God knows you're tired, that you feel overwhelmed. He doesn't want you to keep struggling alone. He wants you to come to him and rest. Now I know what you might be thinking. Okay, but how do I do that? How do I really surrender to God when everything around me seems to be falling apart? Here is where the next important point comes in. Surrendering to God is not something that happens overnight. It's a process, a daily decision, sometimes a decision you make minute by minute. It's not something you do once and it's done, like checking a box on a to-do list. It's ongoing. Every time you face a challenge, a worry, a situation you don't understand, you have the opportunity to surrender it to God. And that surrender won't always be easy. There will be times when you'll want to take back control, when you'll feel that trusting God is risky. But you know what? It's in those moments when you most need to take that step of faith, because here's the truth. God has never failed you before, and He's not going to start now. If you take a look back at your life, you'll probably see moments when, although you didn't know it at the time, God was working in your favor, even amid difficulties. And if He has done it before, He will do it again. But surrendering is not just about trusting that everything will be okay. It's also about learning to listen to God in the midst of chaos. Sometimes we're so busy trying to find solutions on our own that we forget to pause and seek His direction. Because yes, God has a plan, but part of surrendering to Him is being willing to follow His instructions, even when you don't fully understand them. It's like walking on a dark path with only a flashlight that lights a few steps ahead. You can't see the entire path, but you trust that the light you have is enough to guide you. That's how surrendering to God works. He will show you the next step, and when the time is right, He will reveal the next one, and then the next. But you don't have to see it all at once. You just need to trust that the light He is giving you is enough for today. And that leads us to something key: patience. Many times when we're going through tough times, we want quick solutions. We want God to act now, to solve the problem immediately. But His timing is not our timing, and His ways of doing things are often very different from what we expect. Surrendering to God also means trusting in His timing, even if that means waiting longer than we would like. It's like the farmer who plants a seed. He can't make the plant grow faster just because he's in a hurry. He knows he must water it, take care of it, and wait. In the same way, God is working in your life, even when you don't see immediate results. He's cultivating something in you, and when the time is right, you'll see the fruit. So right now, if you feel stuck, if you feel like things aren't moving as you would like, I encourage you to pause, take a deep breath, and remember, God knows exactly what He's doing. He sees the whole picture, even when you can only see a small part. At the end of the day, surrendering to God is not a sign of weakness, but of strength. It's recognizing that we don't have to carry the weight of everything because we have a Father who is more than willing to carry it for us. Imagine how much peace you could have if you stopped trying to control everything. That's what God wants for you. Peace. A peace that only comes when you fully trust in Him. Now that we've talked about what it means to surrender to God and how important it is to trust in Him, let's dive a little deeper into what this looks like in everyday life, because as we said, this is not something that happens overnight. It's a choice you make consistently, and I want us to talk about how you can start to practice it. First of all, when you face a difficult situation, whether it's a health problem, a financial crisis, a broken relationship, or even those moments when it just feels like life is hitting you from all sides, the first thing you should do is recognize that you need help. And it sounds simple, but it's not always easy, right? Sometimes it's hard to admit that we can't handle everything. We're used to thinking that we need to be strong, that we need to figure things out on our own. But here's the first step towards surrendering to God: admitting that no matter how much you try, there are things beyond your control. There are times when you simply don't have the answers, and that's okay, because that's where God steps in. He doesn't expect you to know everything or to have everything under control. In fact, He wants you to recognize that you need Him. That's the true essence of faith, knowing that even though you don't understand everything, you trust in the one who does. Imagine you're in a dark room. You can't see anything. You feel disoriented and scared. But in that darkness, suddenly, you hear the voice of someone who knows you, who loves you, and who knows exactly how to get you out of there. What would you do? Of course, you'd follow that voice because you trust that person, because you know they want the best for you. That's how it works with God. He's there, speaking to you, guiding you, even in the darkest moments. All you need to do is listen to His voice and follow it. And how do you do that? Here's where the next point comes in: prayer. There's no better way to surrender to God than through prayer. Sometimes we think of prayer as a ritual act, something we do because we have to, but in reality, prayer is your direct line to God. It's your moment to be completely honest with Him, to tell Him how you feel, what's worrying you, and to ask for His help. The beauty of prayer is that it doesn't have to be complicated. You don't need fancy words or perfect phrases. God isn't waiting for you to recite something that sounds nice. He wants you to be real, to come to Him just as you are, with your fears, your doubts, your frustrations. And here's where many of us get lost. We think we need to have everything figured out before we come to God. But it's the other way around. It's in the midst of your confusion, your exhaustion, when you most need to talk to Him. And let me tell you something, there's nothing more liberating than bringing your burdens to God. The peace you feel when you talk to Him about what's going on is indescribable. It's like in that moment you stop carrying everything by yourself. You're putting in His hands what you can't solve on your own. And even though the situation might not change immediately, your heart will, because by praying you're saying, God, I trust that you know what's best for me, even though I don't understand it right now. And here's where trust in His will also comes in. Surrendering to God isn't just asking Him to solve your problems the way you want. It's being willing to accept His plan, even if it looks nothing like what you had in mind. And this is hard because we all have an idea of how things should be. We want our prayers answered in a certain way, at a certain time. But surrendering means saying, God, I know you have a better plan, and even though I can't see it now, I trust that you're working on something bigger. Sometimes God answers our prayers in ways we don't expect. Maybe you were hoping He'd remove an obstacle from your path, but instead He's giving you the strength to overcome it. Or maybe you were expecting a quick solution, but He's teaching you patience in the process. Either way, His plan is always for your good, even if it doesn't seem like it at the moment. And this is where something fundamental comes in: patience and trust in God's timing. This is key. Many times when we're going through difficulties, all we want is an immediate solution. We want the pain or uncertainty to go away right now, but God's timing is not ours. He has a much broader view of what He's doing in your life, and sometimes what seems like a delay is actually part of a much deeper process that's happening within you. Look, in the Bible, we find so many stories of people who had to wait, from Abraham waiting for the promise of a son to Joseph, who was sold as a slave and spent years in prison before becoming the governor of Egypt. In each of those stories, the waiting time was not wasted time. God was working, shaping their hearts, preparing them for what was to come, and the same happens with you. Maybe today you don't understand why you have to go through what you're going through, but I assure you that God is using that time to do something much deeper in you. Maybe He's teaching you to depend more on Him, to let go of control, or even to develop a stronger faith. Whatever it is, you can be sure that your waiting is not in vain. So in those moments when you feel that God is taking too long to answer, remember that His timing is perfect. What seems like a delay from your perspective is actually the right moment from God's perspective. And here's where I want to ask you a question. What do you prefer? To keep struggling on your own, trying to control everything, or to trust that the God who created the universe has a much better plan for you? Because that's the truth. He is in control, and His love for you is so great that He will never leave you alone in the middle of your battle. And it's precisely in that process where many of us feel lost, because let's be honest, trusting that God has a bigger plan sounds good in theory, but in practice, when things get complicated, the uncertainty can be overwhelming. That feeling of not having control, of not knowing what will happen tomorrow or how you're going to get out of the situation you're in, can be draining. Have you ever asked God for something and not received a clear answer? Or worse, it seems like things are getting worse instead of better. And then you start wondering, is God really listening to me? Does He really care about what I'm going through? And that's where doubt can come into play, and where many of us start to drift away, trying to solve everything on our own because, well, it seems like God is silent, right? But here's something key I want you to understand. God's silence does not mean His absence. Sometimes when it seems like God isn't answering, it's because He's working in the silence. And I know this can be hard to accept when you're in the middle of pain or confusion, but God is always present, even when you don't feel Him immediately. Think about a teacher during an exam. What does the teacher do? They remain silent, right? Not because they don't care about what's happening, but because the exam is a time when the student has to apply what they've learned. Similarly, there are times in your life when God seems to be silent because He's guiding you to apply the lessons He's taught you previously. It's a time to grow in faith, to learn to trust Him, even when you don't have all the answers. And that's not easy, I know. Uncertainty can be a trial by fire for any of us. We feel uncomfortable, anxious, and sometimes desperate for a quick solution. But it's precisely in those moments where we most need to remember that God has not abandoned us, that His silence is not indifference, but an opportunity to strengthen our faith. This is where another important part of surrendering to God comes in, learning to rest in His peace, even when circumstances are chaotic. And look, I'm not saying that you should simply ignore your problems or pretend that everything is fine when it clearly isn't. But what you can do is choose to trust that God is in control, even when the world around you seems to be upside down. Jesus said it in John 14:27, "Peace I leave with you, my peace I give you. I do not give to you as the world gives. Do not let your hearts be troubled or afraid." That peace that Jesus promises is not the same peace that the world tries to offer. It's not a peace that depends on everything being in its place or that all your problems are solved. It's a peace that comes directly from knowing that, no matter what happens, God is in control and that you're in His hands. And that's something you can experience even in the midst of the storm, because what would be the point of faith if it only worked when everything is fine? True faith is shown in difficult moments when you decide to trust God despite not understanding everything. And that's what it means to surrender to His hands. Now, I want you to think about something. Every time you try to solve everything on your own, how do you feel? I bet that in most cases you end up exhausted, frustrated, and maybe more stressed than before. That happens because you're carrying a weight that doesn't belong to you. God never wanted you to carry all your burdens alone. In fact, one of the most liberating things you can do is stop struggling to have all the answers and simply trust that God already has everything under control. And here's an interesting point. Sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is simply surrender. Not surrender in the sense of giving up, but surrendering to God. Telling Him, "God, I can't handle this by myself. I don't have all the answers, but I trust that you do. I surrender to you. I trust your plan, and I will move forward, knowing that you are with me. That's true surrender. It's not about giving up on your efforts, but about stopping to carry the weight alone and trusting that God is taking control. It's an act of humility, but it's also an act of wisdom, because let's be honest, how many times have we stressed, worried, and exhausted ourselves trying to solve things that only God can handle, and when we finally hand it over to Him, things start to change. Maybe not in the way we expected, but always in the right way. Can you imagine living with that peace, knowing that you don't have to carry it all by yourself? Can you imagine how liberating it would be to simply trust that God has control of every detail of your life, even the smallest ones? That's the invitation that God is making to you today. It's not a promise that everything will be easy or that you won't face difficulties, but it is a promise that when you surrender to Him, you find a peace and a strength that you couldn't find anywhere else. And it's a real promise, a promise that God has made throughout the entire Bible. I will be with you, He says in Isaiah 41:10. It's not a maybe or a depends on how you behave. It's a certainty. God is with you, and His presence in your life doesn't depend on your circumstances. No matter how difficult the moment you're going through, He's by your side, waiting for you to surrender to His hands so that you can experience His peace and His power in a way you never imagined. And that freedom we're talking about, the one that comes when you surrender to God, is something so profound that it goes far beyond simply stopping to worry about the things you can't control. It's a complete change in how you live your life, in how you see the world around you, and more importantly, in how you see your relationship with God. You see, when we talk about surrendering to God, we often think about the big decisions, right? Things like changing jobs, family problems, or health crises. And yes, of course, those are moments where you need to fully trust God, but there's something else that we often overlook. Surrendering to God also happens in the small details of everyday life. Think about it for a moment. How many times have you found yourself worrying about something that at the end of the day wasn't that important? Maybe it was an argument with a friend, a deadline at work, or even a misunderstanding. And before you know it, you're stressed, you feel upset or frustrated, and all of that robs you of your peace. But what if in those small moments you also learned to surrender to God? It's easy to think that we only need to trust Him in the big storms, but the truth is that God is also interested in the smallest details of your life. He wants you to live with peace and freedom, not just in the important decisions, but also in the small ones. That constant worry, that stress that consumes you over things that really don't weigh that much, is an unnecessary burden that God doesn't want you to carry. The Bible tells us in Philippians 4:6-7, "Do not be anxious about anything. Rather, in every situation, by prayer and petition, present your requests to God and give thanks. And the peace of God, which transcends all understanding, will guard your hearts and your minds in Christ Jesus." Notice what it says. In every situation, not just in moments of crisis, but in every situation. God wants you to trust Him with every detail, every worry, no matter how small it may seem. Imagine how different your days would be if, instead of letting those small things rob you of your peace, you put them in God's hands. Because surrendering to God is not something you do once and it's done. It's ongoing, daily. It's a way of living, a lifestyle where in every situation, big or small, you choose to trust that God is in control and that His peace can fill your heart at any moment. And I want to be honest with you. This won't always be easy. There will be moments when you find yourself caught up in worry or the desire to control everything yourself. We're human, and the temptation to handle things our way will always be there. But it's precisely in those moments where you most need to remember what we've already talked about, that God is with you and that His plan for you is perfect, even if you can't see it at this moment. When you decide to surrender the small details of your life to God, something incredible starts to happen. You begin to live with a lightness you hadn't experienced before. It's like suddenly that weight you were carrying on your shoulders starts to disappear. You no longer have to worry about every little obstacle because you know that God is already working in every aspect of your life. And when you stop worrying about those details, you can start to enjoy life more. You can be more present in your relationships, in your daily activities, because your mind and heart are not consumed by stress or anxiety. And here, I want you to think about something important. How many times have you missed moments of happiness or peace because your mind was elsewhere? Maybe you were physically present with your friends or family, but your mind was trapped in worries or problems that you couldn't solve at that moment. And what happens is that you miss out on what God is giving you today. That's what I want you to see clearly. When you decide to surrender to God, when you trust that He has everything under control, you're not just letting go of stress, you're also opening up space to enjoy more of the life He has given you. Because God doesn't want you to live trapped in constant worries. He wants you to live with joy, with peace, and to be able to enjoy every blessing He has given you. Can you imagine how different your life would be if you started living that way? If every day you chose to surrender to God not just your big problems, but also those small details that sometimes seem insignificant but end up robbing you of your peace. The key is consistency. It's a daily act, a decision you make over and over again. Today, I choose to trust God. Today, I choose to give everything to Him, from the biggest to the smallest, and I know that He is with me. And the wonderful thing is that when you start doing this, little by little your perspective changes. You no longer see problems the same way. You no longer feel overwhelmed by every little difficulty because you know you're not alone in this. You know that God is working in your favor and that even though you don't see the results immediately, you can trust that everything is under His control. That's what it means to live a life of surrender to God. It's not just an abstract idea or something that only happens in moments of crisis. It's a way to live every day, every moment, with the assurance that God cares for you and guides you. It's choosing again and again to surrender to His hands and rest in His peace.